Thank you everyone for joining today. Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you're joining today. We'd like to introduce this webinar series presented by Ingram Microcloud devoted to helping you de-risk your cybersecurity offering, titled Sink or Swim, Using Contracts Effectively to De-risk Your Cybersecurity Offerings. My name is Briana.lau. If you haven't met me before on previous Seamless Security webinar series webinars, I am the Growth Solutions Lead here for Seamless Security at Ingram Micro, and we're joined by a special guest today. Anne Hall is joining us from New Zealand, so down in the APAC region, and she's the founder of ITagree, aka the Agreement Lifeguard, providing legal agreements as a service globally after just seeing how much MSPs and IT companies have been struggling with customer agreements and figuring out a way to support them as IT lawyers specific to MSPs and supporting them. So before we talk a little bit more about this topic around de-risking through agreements, especially around cybersecurity services, I just want to get started with a few housekeeping notes around just how this webinar is generally conducted. We are live today, currently streaming through Teams webinar. So if you want to reshare this deck or this recording to a colleague, or want to re-listen to it at another time, it will be left on demand. And all the links will be submitted to you via email. That's going to be coming in 24 hours after we finalize. And because we are live and we have our audience here, we are taking questions either in the chat window at the time that we're presenting, or you can wait until the end. We've left around 5 to 7 minutes at the end to answer any questions that you might have around content that was presented. So let's move on to agenda and talk about what we're going to be discussing today. For the agenda on the next slide, we will be talking first around the importance of de-risking your cybersecurity services, why MSP should be looking around IT agreements as a way to proactively protect themselves around maybe cybersecurity services and the expectations that that brings for their customers. We're going to be doing an introduction to ITagree, where Anne will take it off and go through some of the examples of downfalls of partners disregarding contracts or, hodgepodging contracts to make it applicable to all of their customers, for example. Recommendations for shared responsibility between customers and partners, what that should generally look like in your agreements, and how you can purchase on Cloud Marketplace, just as an FYI in case you're interested. And then, of course, we'll close with Q&A. So before I pass it to Anne, I just want to quickly discuss the importance of the topic around cybersecurity services and how that reflects into agreements. It was really important for me to bring this topic into our series for Seamless Security, just because, as we know, cybersecurity is a really risky practice to start with. You're essentially putting yourself at the front line of protecting your customers, and they're relying on you to keep them secure. So it's important for you as yourself to consider proactive areas to reduce the business risk that comes in venturing into this service, and also understanding some of the common misconceptions of customers when it comes to cybersecurity services, and really reassuring that into the agreement before anything is signed. We understand that every partner has a different approach. We see that some may not be using agreements, which is a very, very small subset. Some might have agreements, but it's generally a hodgepodge of legal terms, deliverables, descriptions, and materials that have been pieced together by someone in the organization maybe years ago and hasn't been updated frequently to address kind of the existing advancements of technology, services, and cybersecurity risk. And then, there's a subset of partners that may have outsourced to an attorney with experience, perhaps in IT, that oftentimes the experience doesn't match up to the expectations of what you are delivering as an MSP and the MSP-related services that need to be covered in said agreement. So it's important that we bring this all together, understand that all partners worldwide are struggling with the agreements. which is why, segueing to Anne to talk about the details of this discussion, it's important that she had started her business in 2016, just based on the main challenge of where do I start? What's the right way to do it? And she's been doing this for the last 25 years and really helping MSPs refine their agreements across North America, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and most of the European countries. So without further ado, I'd love to pass it to Anne to get us started and really go through the details of this webinar.
Thanks, Brianna, and hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to present to you today. A hugely important topic, as Brianna said, with cybersecurity services being fraught with risk as regards MSP's offerings. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the types of risk. What sort of risk are we talking about, and how do contracts fit into that? And a couple of key ways that you can use contracts to more effectively manage those risks, with examples of partners along the way. And so first of all, just to set the scene, I would like to say that, what we see all of the time is partners, providing amazing services, but so often saying that they're concerned about business risk. So it is, a very, very real topic that we're hearing about all of the time. And I just really like to help to manage that risk. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the types of risks that we're talking about here. You can see in the yellow, this is often the area where partners think, that's my risk. My risk is the risk of legal proceedings, and I need a contract to look after that risk. As you can see, and sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but there are a whole lot of other risks, and I'm sure you're aware of these. But these are all the sorts of risks that can be better managed using the right sort of agreement. So if we just look at a couple of them, you've got customers not taking up your recommendations, a big risk area for MSPs. The risks around, reselling cloud services. Where do your responsibilities begin and end, and what do your customers perceive of that? Out of scope requests. Brianna mentioned the length of time that I've been involved in this sort of work, and certainly right through the 90s. And continuing, out of scope requests are a problem, whether it's for projects or managed services. The missed upsell opportunities, which is on the flip side is a positive one. If you're missing upsell opportunities, you can use contracts more effectively to open up those upsell opportunities. I won't talk in length about all of these, but just to highlight that there are a whole lot of different types of business risks here, which I call the everyday risks. They're the risks that are probably much more real to you than the risk of legal proceedings, which of course lurks and overshadows things. But if we can manage all of the other risks, there is in fact a much less chance of the legal proceedings ever, that worst case scenario ever arriving. So I just wanted to show you this slide with the guy with his hands on his head. He's the, what if we're sued thinking around contracts. And, a lot of people, as I mentioned, seem to think that contract is there for the worst case scenario. And if, this type of approach really looks at contracts as being there reactively if you were ever facing legal proceedings. But as I've just mentioned, we can use contracts proactively to manage all of those everyday types of risks. This kind of thinking with the guy with his hands on his head, I hope our contract will save us if anything ever happens. So we can do a lot better than that. We don't need to wait and hope that scenario never arrives. We can actually proactively manage the risks. Okay. So I've got an example here of Jonathan, and I just want to preempt this example by saying that, you're all providing quite a range of different services. Managed service providers are also reselling 365, reselling other third-party cloud services, doing project work, often now comms and internet connectivity, and especially now, of course, topical, the cybersecurity services that so many are either in or branching into with different types of cybersecurity offerings. So just want to really emphasize to you here, and this is one of the key ways that you can manage your risks, is identify and have agreements that are really specific to the types of services you're providing. So in terms of reselling here, Jonathan, May last year, the customer buys the firewall as a service. The pricing was just included on the invoice, no specific contract around that. In October, there's a cyber incident, and they thought they were protected by the service, but in fact, Jonathan jumps in quickly to try and resolve things. When he tries to invoice for the additional time spent, the customer disputes that because they think, well, hang on, we've bought this service from you, and why do we now have to pay more? They're actually unhappy because why did they have an incident in the first place? So Jonathan here is left with a situation. He has sold this service. The basis of reselling that service was unclear. He does face some difficult issues around the invoicing, but on top of all of that, he's concerned, what is his bigger risk here? And this is potentially a worst case scenario. He has not managed that risk well because the customer really had no idea about the basis on which that service was being provided. Now, reality check. Here's a couple of things. And of course, the third-party services are so critical to the provision of services that you are offering. So, if you think about the firewall, being such a critical part, what is the responsibility and who's carrying the risk around that supply? Is it the vendors? Is it the partner? Should it be you, or should it be the customer that's taking on that risk around cyber attacks? And what I've done here, which I'm sure hardly anyone ever does, is actually look at these vendor contracts. And as you can see here in the first example with the firewall vendor, and this is from a vendor's contract. I won't be naming the vendors here, but in fact, if you look at any vendor contract, they seem to have these sorts of provisions in there. In this case, there is no warranty, representation, or indemnity that the product will detect, identify, or disable all or any specific harmful programs, viruses, or harmful components. So really that vendor is taking little to no responsibility for the firewall. That's not great news for Jonathan, because of course he's sold the firewall and he hasn't really protected himself around that. And so nor does the vendor when it comes to that relationship. Likewise, for the RMM vendor, there's very much the same sort of provision. There is a limited 30-day warranty, very, very limited, but everything is excluded in terms of fitness for particular purpose, accuracy, reliability, security, and so on. So when the cyber attacks come in through the RMM, that RMM vendor is saying, that's not on us. Our product does not, we're excluding all liability, that it keeps you secure. So amongst other things. So really what I'm identifying here for you is the vendors are not taking full responsibility for these services. And so you need to, really closely think about how you're going to protect yourselves. And in fact, of course, you don't want to be taking the responsibility on that your vendors are not even taking on themselves. Now, just how that looks in terms of the supply chain, the channel, and where your contract fits. So the MSP here, their relationship with the customer, that's where your contract fits. As you can see, all the ticks in the green circles, everybody else is protecting themselves, and it's vital that you protect yourself too. Now, that's true whether you're reselling cybersecurity services or other services, Microsoft 365, whatever it is. You have this situation here, and the vendor terms. Some partners will say to me, let's say with Microsoft 365, of course, the Microsoft customer agreement applies. Yes, but that is between Microsoft and the customer. It's not doing anything to protect you. So you need your own contract here for that purpose. as I've highlighted here, when reselling third-party services, or indeed when including third-party services and other services such as managed services, then go ahead and protect yourself. You can do that with specific contracts, with provisions in your contracts to really provide that protection. The same is true with the RMM side, which is a different diagram, but bearing in mind that cyber attacks do commonly come in through that avenue, that's a really key area where we need to focus as well. Now, the second key way that you can use contracts to effectively manage your risks is, think of it from the customer's perspective. The customer comes to you because they trust you. They can see that you have loads of experience, expertise, and skills, and they trust you. And that trust is really important. In fact, it's essential. But trust alone is the cause of many problems. So what I've described here on this slide is the barrier of expertise, recognizing that really large imbalance between your skills, knowledge, and experience and what your customers understand. So we need to bring the two a little more closely together, overcome that barrier of expertise, and really have contracts that are meaningful not only to you, but also to your customer. Because when it comes to, something like out of scope requests, if your customer doesn't understand what is in scope, then they'll just be firing everything at you, putting a lot of responsibility, expectation, assumptions on you without ever thinking, who is actually responsible for this, because they don't understand. An example here, a CEO that I talked to, she said we've moved after 20, they'd been in business 20 years, moved from break fix into managed services, and now moving into cyber as well. She said, really, we don't have any problems with contracts, and our customers just sign and we get started. The problems only start after the contract is signed. So this is a scenario that I hear often. And going back to the earlier slide, partners saying, we've never had a problem. That thinking of the contract is there to save us. We've never had a problem means, in Julia's world and many other partners, we've never had a problem. We've never faced legal proceedings. But all of the sorts of issues, those everyday issues, yes, of course, you see what Julia is saying, the problems start after the contract is signed, the problems of revenue leakage, of out of scope work, that their team is managing at no additional charge, the responsibility for cyber attacks, that's causing great concern, and we have no effective way of managing that. Customers not meeting their responsibilities. We talk about shared responsibilities, and it's not all on the partner, or it should not be, to deliver. There's also obligations on the customer, not just for paying, but for other aspects as well. One of those things is taking up your recommendations, and you cannot deliver the service that you're anticipating to deliver if your customers don't take up your recommendations, and missing out on upsell opportunities. So in Julia's case, there were a lot of issues going on, and what she needed to really appreciate was that those everyday issues could be overcome by actually seeing the contract as a record of what's being agreed. So what are you actually agreeing? What do customers understand by what you're agreeing? And really iron out those grey areas, because those are where you're getting the revenue leakage. And, most partners that we talk with, their revenue leakage, they will estimate at least 5% of their revenue. So, this is money that's being left on the table. It's not about nickel and diming customers. It's about getting paid for the work that you're doing and not having those sources of revenue leakage with out of scope work and missed upsell opportunities and so on. So the good news is that you can use contracts to better manage risk. I have talked about a couple of those key ways that you can do that by really using service-specific contracts and really getting alignment of expectations so that your customers have a strong understanding of what it is you're actually doing, of the service commitments that you're making to them, and what's expected in turn from the customer. This climber here is using his ropes to manage his risk. Likewise, you can use contracts to better manage your risk. Without using the right sort of contracts, you're leaving it open for customers to make all sorts of assumptions about the service that you are providing. You can be very prone to that out of scope work turning into a strong source of revenue leakage, which is not desirable, of course. The other risk areas that I've mentioned around reselling cybersecurity third-party services, but also around Microsoft 365, especially with the NCE changes. So, the net result here is if you use the right agreements and use them properly, you really can better manage your risks. Now, we'll just move on to where you can access ITagree if you're interested. Briana's mentioned this at the outset. So there's a number of countries where ITagree is available on the Ingram Micro Cloud Marketplace. To find ITagree, you can simply enter ITagree in the search bar. I think you need to put it in as one word. If you put two, we might not come up, but put it in as one word in the search bar. Otherwise, if you look in that business applications category, you will find us there. Now, there are various agreement options on the marketplace right now. I have good news is that that's all going to be simplified down to one agreement solution plan very shortly, hopefully this month. But right now you can achieve the same result with what's on this slide by purchasing the what's called Flexi plus Beacon. Soon that will be combined into one offering, and there will only be one offering. The plan includes, as you can see from the name, 5 agreements. That's 5 agreements that you can take and use with all your customers. We do begin with a consultation session for the agreement selection. So we've got quite an extensive range of agreements that have been built up by what partners are asking us for. And indeed, right now, most of the questions are around different types of cybersecurity offerings. So there's the base of master services agreements, managed services agreements, agreements for reselling 365 and Azure and so on, 365 under Azure, under NCE, project agreements, backup, BCDR, all sorts of things. But it's the cybersecurity services agreements that partners are really asking us for as a new add-on to the types of services that they're offering. So we do begin with the consultation session. Go back onto the blue on the left, 5 agreements to take and use with all of your customers. After that session, we deliver them to you within 48 hours. You're doing a setup task, adding details in of the, for example, in the managed services, the way that your managed services works, what's included and what's the pricing for that. We do run weekly sessions to assist you with that, and the recordings are available, and there's ongoing assistance available. So we're on hand, when you need us through our forums, and we do provide agreement updates. Okay, so that brings me to the end of what I wanted to discuss with you. I hope that's been useful.
Thanks, Anne. So we left 5 minutes in case anyone has some questions around, contracts, agreements that they'd love to ask Anne during this time. We've had a comment on the chat window that says, ITagree, if you are searching it on Ingram Micro's Cloud Marketplace, it is one word, like you said, Anne. So that's going to help you find it easier and get started with working with Anne and potentially revising any agreements with her support. Any questions from our audience? I have a question. So around the agreements, you said that it's 48 hours for generally an MSP to get their hands on a copy. What are some of the engagement elements in providing that level of structure from their business perspective, and you drafting up something?
Yeah, so we have a range of agreements that are effectively ready now to take and provide to managed service providers. And we have that initial consultation session just to understand what services they're providing, because, people will say they're an MSP, but they're providing quite a range of other services as well. Even the way that they're providing their managed service varies. So we've got different forms of managed services agreements. So we determine with the MSP which agreements they need. That usually, we set that for a 25-minute meeting to
Mhm.
hear about the services that they're providing, and to then determine which agreements are right. Then we deliver those. So then it's then with the partner to go through and obviously put their name onto the agreements, make them their own. There are there are there are lots of areas, particularly in the managed services agreement, where things like, what is your price per user and what is included in your managed service, because that varies a lot. We provide a comprehensive framework within the agreements into which they put those details. So the resource time from the partner side is, someone needs to take that on board. We have had, I recall one partner who said, "Oh, can't I just put my name on the top of it and send it out to everybody?" Well, it actually is your agreement, so you need to, to understand what's in there and make sure that it fits with the way that you're working. They are certainly drafted so that that will be the case, but you do need to put in some details, and depending on which agreement it is, there's more detail. So some of the agreement documents don't require too much time. Others will require 2 or 3 hours to put in details of the services, and that's why we run the weekly sessions to do a
Mhm.
walkthrough and to be there to answer any questions that you might have while you're doing that.
Yes, and since then, we've had 2 to 3 other questions, and so what is
Mhm.
the legality of the agreements?
The legality.
Just yeah.
So in terms of jurisdiction, perhaps that question is about?
Yeah, I guess, because you've been specific to certain countries that you operate in, what is the
Sure.
legality of the agreements? Yeah.
Yes, yes. So certainly that's a good question, given I'm in New Zealand and, and we're providing the agreements out to multiple countries. We work with lawyers in different countries to modify the agreements so that they're appropriate for that jurisdiction. Um, Interestingly, you know, as you might understand quickly when I mention this, is that what an MSP is doing in London or in California or in Sydney, the issues are much the same. And in fact, the contract, given it's very performance based, doesn't need to change very much for those aspects. But there are, of course, jurisdictional differences, and that's what we take care of by getting the modifications made per country.
And so specific to Canada, they are customized for provincial as well as federal laws in a Canadian agreement, for example.
For Quebec, we have a different version, but aside from that, the main difference there really for Canada is around the personal data protection. Even in the States, there are not MSP specific legislation is really only in 3 states, and that relates to MSPs that are dealing with government entities, and it's very limited at the moment as to those differences. So for Canada, there is a Canadian version and the Quebec version. There's not
Mhm.
different versions aside from that.
Gotcha. And then for your service line on Ingram's Marketplace, what is the standard length of your service, and is it renewed yearly?
Okay, so there is a minimum of 12 months. After that, it depends on which plan you buy, but the new plan that's coming out, if I can talk about that one, because it's probably easier, will be a monthly with a 12-month commit, and then after that, continuing monthly, unless you don't require the service anymore. Some people say,
Mhm.
why would I need to continue? Which is a good question, especially for those partners that may have had the same contract for 5 years or 10 years. And the answer to that is simply that things are changing, and the pace of change, in your business, and what the services that you're offering needs to be reflected in updates to your agreements. So we make changes based on what's going on in the market, what's going on with the types of services being offered by partners, what's going on with customers' expectations, and of course changes in the law.
Yeah, those are really great questions from our audience. I would love to push maybe and your email in the chat window, just in case there's any follow-up questions that might have been thought after our webinar ends. So I've put Anne's email in the chat window. If you have any questions, feel free to email her. Feel free to email Ingram or your representative around the solution. But this is a really great just idea of how you can be super proactive with how you're delivering your security services. And thank you so much, Anne, for bringing your expertise onto this call.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.